Hello, welcome back to the Finding Middle Sunday edition, brought to you, obviously, by the MiddleGround mic. Today's conversation is heavy but important. The sudden assassination of Charlie Kirk, it's really shocked a lot of us, even days later. No matter what you thought of his politics, Charlie represented something undeniable, a fierce conviction in his beliefs and a willingness to stand in the arena. But his passing forces us to reflect on the bigger picture. What happens when conviction hardens into extremism? Here in Michigan, we've seen glimpses of what that looks like. And if we don't find balance, extremism could consume our politics here in Michigan and nationally even more. Our communities and hello, everybody. Let's kind of talk about Charlie Kirk's legacy and lessons for a second. He was the founder of Turning Point USA. Definitely one of the most influential conservative youth movements in our country currently, if not one of the most influential of all time, I would say. He shaped college campuses, he drove a lot of national debates, and he brought millions of young people into the political conversation, which is what we need for a sustainable future for our country. But beyond the headlines, he valued the idea of disagreement without dehumanization, which is something that we really, really, really value here at this podcast. He was outspoken, yes, controversial, no doubt, but he was also a man of faith who believed in America's promise. Here's the truth. Conviction is powerful no matter your opinion. It can move people, it can change policy, and it can really shape the next generation. But conviction without balance can become dangerous. That's where extremism creeps in. When our desire to win becomes more important than our willingness to listen. Let's talk about extremism in Michigan politics, because if you want a front row seat of how extremism can be, look in your own community, because I'm sure there's plenty there. Remember, at one point, there was a group of gentlemen that tried to kidnap the Governor Whitmer. That wasn't politics. That was people being frustrated about the pandemic, and it fueled people to turn a certain group of people to turn radical. Disagreement about COVID turned it into a violent plot. I don't know how far things would have went. I'm not part of that, thing, but school boards, right? We've seen parents scream at each other in school meetings, not about math scores or teacher shortages, but about banning books. Some books do need to be banned if they're of nature that don't really belong around elementary students, things of that nature. But, rewriting history, labeling every disagreement as indoctrination. When local classrooms become battlegrounds, kids lose. But in context with that, it's not always necessarily a battleground and kids lose, right? It can be. But we also have to remember we got to keep all ideas open as long as they're not degrading and they don't try to change who a kid can be, right? We had a lot of issues with, election integrity here. Nothing that from what I've seen, heard, any evidence that would have changed anything necessarily. But again, polling places like in Detroit and across our state became ground zero for protests. Neighbors stood opposite sides of police tapes, shouting about stolen votes, fraud conspiracies. Democracy can't function when trust collapses. We will force things to go in a direction that we don't want it. We can talk about an example of division inside of our state, right? It's not just on the news. It's the conversations at the grocery store, in our union halls, at churches. People stop seeing each other as Michiganders and we start labeling each other as enemies. That's how extremism spreads slowly, personally, neighbor by neighbor. Extremism doesn't creep in up overnight. It sneaks in little by little, and it uses fear to take hold of us. Some people are going to say Democrat is un-American or Republican is an American. A lot of people like to use that phrase Nazi and fascist when describing Republicans. I really encourage people who truly feel that way to go look at those things. And neither side, to a point, you can use certain cherry pick points, but overall, neither side, like 99%, it has they're nothing in common with those. This rhetoric pushes people further to the right or further to the left, and they isolate each other more. Other voices claim every conservative is a threat to democracy, which is crazy and ignorant to me. They paint entire communities as villains instead of recognizing nuance. This rhetoric pushes people to a point to radicalize on the left. Meanwhile, in Michigan, most of us just want affordable groceries, working roads, good Lord, and that are actually fixed and not under repair every single day. We want safe schools and, and leaders who don't embarrass us in the national stage, because the loudest voices dominate and the middle ground gets drowned out. But this show will not be drowned out. People will recognize that there is a middle ground. Sometimes you do have to take a hard stance on certain things. That's just part of life. But for most situations, we can find a middle ground. We can find compromise. How do we find balance in the state of Michigan? how do we stop extremism from swallowing us whole, by making balance and fairness and the respect for every individual, no matter where you come from or your religion, louder than the fringes. When lawmakers put aside differences, look at, we finally got the Allen and Van Horn Bridge downriver to get built. That wasn't about left or right. That's about safety. For ambulances having access to the hospitals, not having to sit there for 3 hours and you're home from work. That's balance in action. That's Lansing getting something done. That's them working together, which they're very capable of. I'm very big on the fact that I think state governments have more of an impact of improving the quality of our life than they do at the federal level, than the federal government does, I should say. Healthcare cooperation, right? The opioid crisis responses across Michigan have brought together Democrats and Republicans, pastors, doctors, sheriffs, social workers. This is what happens when people care more about the solutions than the slogans. We all recognize that our communities were getting destroyed by something, and they went after it because they recognized we're all in that same battle together. Michigan's manufacturing recovery, from electric vehicles to steel, it's required compromise between business leaders, unions, and policymakers. This extremism didn't build those jobs. Cooperation did. Imagine if we applied this same spirit to education, healthcare, immigration, and what if instead of shouting about who's wrong, we asked, how can we build something that works, that allows us all to exist as humans, allows us all to exist, allows us to figure out how to work together. At some point, we have to come away from the far sides of each left and right. We have to find it because no matter what, we all have to live on the same dirt. We all have to occupy the same country. We have to go to the same grocery stores. We asked, how can we build something that works? That's balance. We can do it here in Michigan. We have done it. Not necessarily the biggest fan of the governor, right? But she has done some things that required support from both sides of the aisle. So it is possible. It is possible for Democrats and Republicans in this state to work together. We can work together. We must work together. The children in this state, the citizens of the state, everybody needs it. It never ends. We have to stick together. We're Michiganders. We're Americans. We can't let crazy people occupy everything we do. We can't let them infiltrate our minds. Let's reflect on some of this a little bit. Charlie Kirk's death is tragic, but it's been a wake-up call for a lot of people on that side. No voice lasts forever, but the culture he's helped create, that passion in people, it's what he left behind that is like going to change the world. I think I remember a post yesterday saying that they went from 1,100, I think it's 1,100 chapters, to they have applications now for over 18,000 chapters across the United States. That's a revolution. That's not what we're getting. No. If you go from 1,100 chapters to applications for Turning Point USA to over 18,000, that is a movement. That's a revolution. It's happening. I love to see things like that because, contrary to what extremists and people on the far left will say, I truly don't believe Charlie Kirk was racist. Do I agree with everything he said? No, but I don't believe that he was. I could be wrong, right? I'm not people of those origins, but I don't think he was trying to be racist. I think he was trying to point out how he felt. And there's a lot of people that feel that way. I don't feel that way to the degree that he did, but there were some valid points in there. Will Michigan be remembered for plots, protests, polarization, or will we be remembered for building a model of balance the rest of the country can follow? Like, look at Office Depot or Office Max. I think they're both, whatever one you want to call it now. Those two individuals that got fired because they refused to print a poster that all it did was have the picture of Charlie, had his birth year and his this year that he died, and they wanted to use politics as a reason not to print it. They tried to hide behind that they don't do that. Like, come on. I mean, the company did the right thing, and they let them go. People shouldn't be fired for having an opinion, but when you're doing things like that to be detrimental out of spite, there is a price to pay no matter who you are. One of the biggest questions that we face is, where does the finding the middle exist? Where do we find the middle in these situations? Well, that's kind of where we got to go with it. Like education. It's so important. But how do we find that balance there? How do we make sure that it's about education and not these pockets where some extremists jump in and then it becomes that's all it's about, right? Because then it over dominates everything and all the good people get tuned out. And then we're doing nothing but fighting. Same with the roads. We're too busy arguing about, well, we want to raise this tax, we don't want to raise taxes. I get it. But what we need to do is there needs to be a comprehensive analysis. Hey, Michiganders, this is what we need. This is what it's going to cost. This is the timeline. But also talk about how can we invest in these roads long term for maintenance that we don't have to have them repaired so often. Bring those conversations to the voter. That's what the voter wants. And if you do that, you'll find that the voter goes, hey, okay, ABC, if this is going to do it long term. And I encourage the voters to say, hey, hey, Lansing, if we're going to repair, such and such a road, should we put a future investment rate in front of it? Like, do we set aside a certain dollar amount to maintain it the long term to help the longevity of the road? And whenever you do need to repair it, or replace it, I should say, you're not coming back to me with an extra tax dollar. We can fund it with what we got going on. There has to be more to it. This is Joe. Hope everybody has a good day. Talk to you next week.